The West wants in was the Reform Party's slogan back in the late 1980s and early 90s. But to judge from the latest Alberta leadership contest, does it now seem as if the West wants out? And Quebec has just re-elected certainly a staunchly nationalist, if not actively sovereigntist government. With us now to consider what all this portends for Canadian federalism, we're joined by, in Oxford, UK, Howard Anglin, former Principal Secretary to Alberta Premier Jason Kenney and a postgraduate researcher in constitutional law at the University of Oxford. In Calgary, Alberta, Martin Olshinsky, Associate Professor of Law at the University of Calgary. In Montreal, Quebec, Renaud Brossard, Senior Director of Communications at the Montreal Economic Institute. And here in our studio, Nathalie Desrosiers, Principal at the University of Toronto's Massey College. And Madame, un grand plaisir to have you back here again in our studio. And to our guests in Points Beyond, thank you for joining us tonight on TVO. Martin, I'll put you to work first because both Saskatchewan and Alberta's premiers have announced moves that would purport to give those two provinces much more provincial autonomy, the Drawing the Line policy and the Sovereignty Act, respectively, Saskatchewan and Alberta. Just in a nutshell, what do you think's going on here? What are they trying to do?
So I think there's a couple things going on. The first thing I think I need to say is that, I hope that none of our friends out east think that this is like a monolithic move or that this represents the broad sort of desires of Albertans or even people in Saskatchewan. I think it's pretty clear for those of us living here that right now the political class and the leadership class, both in Alberta and Saskatchewan, is really trying to play to their base. And their base is increasingly hostile towards Ottawa. So I think that's a really important point right off the bat is I think that it's easy to overstate the broad support for these kinds of policies, both in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So as a starting point. The second point really is, I think, and I'm curious to hear my panelists' sort of views on this, but really what seems to be happening is that Alberta and Saskatchewan, in terms of our leaders, seem to be wanting to undo the clock on about 60 years of constitutional law and doctrine in Canada. So what I mean by that is that this idea that somehow provincial jurisdiction over natural resources are this enclave that can't be violated, it can't be affected, that provincial policies and preferences, frankly, can't be affected by valid federal laws and valid federal policies. And that's just not the case. That hasn't been the case from our Supreme Court for several decades. And it's certainly not the case now. We understand that, when we're talking about legislative jurisdiction, constitutional authority, the provinces have clear authority under Section 92 over certain things. The federal government has clear authority over other things under Section 91. And that these things overlap. And when we can get into some specific examples about those overlap and what that means, but what it really means, it has meant over the past 20 years, is that our federation is about compromise and cooperation. And what we just seem to be seeing along fairly predictable partisan lines is provincial leaders in Alberta and Saskatchewan rejecting that basic premise and saying, no, we want to act unilaterally within our territory, frankly.
All right, let me go to Howard Anglin on this, because we know, Howard, that your former boss, Jason Kenney, was not a fan of the Sovereignty Act. And yet, here we go. We have a new Alberta Premier, his successor, who is pitching it. What do you think's going on?
I think the first thing to note is it's hard to know even what the Sovereignty Act is right now. I wrote quite a strongly worded piece criticizing it back in July when the only version we had was produced by I think Danielle Smith, then campaign manager, who'd produced it sometime the year before. Mm-hmm. It was a pretty extreme document. And I was pretty critical of particularly two aspects. One was the idea that you'd effectively set up a parallel court system that would be appointed by the Alberta government. And the other was, in effect, a large-scale tax revolt that would be backstopped by the ATB, the Alberta Provincial Bank. Those, to be blunt, were bonkers ideas. I would say the government seems to have backed off those ideas. I haven't heard them mentioned recently. And the descriptions of the Sovereignty Act and what it will do have evolved over time. Yeah. It seems to now just be focused on enforcement powers, which are broadly within the provincial government's authority. And if that's what it ends up being, if it ends up just being the government is going to set priorities for when it cooperates and when it decides that a federal priority is not a provincial priority for enforcement, then it's closer to what we've seen in other provinces. For example, when Quebec effectively didn't enforce abortion laws in the 70s, or when Ontario and Quebec didn't enforce assisted suicide laws, or BC didn't enforce prostitution or drug laws, or Saskatchewan, frankly, didn't enforce the long gun registry laws. And by not enforce, I say they just made it not a policing priority. So it's closer to what we've seen in Canada at this point. Saskatchewan's document, and I have an article in the hub.ca today. It's the first of a 3-part article talking about Saskatchewan's policy. Frankly, it's the worst written document I've ever seen from a Canadian government. But if you hack your way through the grammatical and syntactical jungle, it looks kind of like where the Sovereignty Act is now. It's more focused on provincial powers over enforcement. And in that sense, I think it's broadly within a Canadian tradition of sort of creative non-compliance by the provinces.
Well, it has been one of the most ridiculed documents in a very long time. Not just the criticisms you observe, but the math doesn't work out by a factor of billions and billions and billions of dollars. Okay, Nathalie Desrosiers, as a former constitutional scholar, you will well know that the term that Howard just used, bonkers, is a technical constitutional
Yeah, that's true. We use
term.
it all the time.
Yes. What do you think's going on here?
Well, I think it's a rhetorical document. These are is the Western alienation expressing itself in ways to try to challenge a little bit the position and the way in which federalism works. But I agree, I think, with Howard that we don't really know what it says, the Sovereignty Act, because there's been backtracking, and to the extent that she now says that she's not going to disagree with the courts, that she's going to abide by what the Supreme Court says. I think it really is not it doesn't have much teeth. I mean, to the extent that she says, well, I will abide by the Supreme Court of Canada, this is what we expect of provinces that are bound by the rule of law. If you're not going to abide by the Supreme Court, then you should leave. Like, I think she had to find a way to reassure people that although she does play the politics of anger here, but that she was not asking to separate or to create an independent Alberta. And that's what I read in it. What is interesting is that there are mechanisms if you think that the federal government is outside of its jurisdiction. They've been used for 150 years. You sue them.
Yeah, go to court.
You go to court and you expose your case. And sometimes, and at times, often, provinces have been able to win or limit some of the things that they disagreed, whether it was on reproductive technologies or it was on a new federal securities commission. So it's not as though there's no ability for you to express your sense that indeed they're overreaching. Now, sometimes you will lose. And that's what happened with the carbon tax. And therefore, if you believe in the rule of law, you say, okay, now I have to negotiate my way, but I have to obey it. Otherwise, it will be chaos.
Renaud, do you think that in some ways Quebec has led the way for Alberta and Saskatchewan in that, of course, it has been somewhat sovereigntist in the way that it has attempted to govern over the last many years? Has it been an inspiration to these Western provinces, in your view?
I believe so. I see a lot of parallel, actually, with former Quebec Liberal Premier Robert Bourassa's knife to the throat strategy when it comes to constitutional negotiation, which was to always be willing to negotiate with the federal government, but always keep a subtle threat of inflaming sovereignty sentiment. And I think this is very much a strategic and a tactical decision by Smith with the Sovereignty Act, but also by Scott Moe with the Drawing the Line proposal, because it's about sending a message to Ottawa. It's about sending a message that provinces like Alberta, like Saskatchewan, have long felt neglected in the Canadian Federation. This is nothing new. I mean, as the introduction mentioned, the Reform Party slogan was "The West wants in." So there's been this long-standing sentiment, and to an extent, of course, from a constitutional perspective, there's the powers that are handed to the provinces, but to an extent, you also have the powers that provinces dare to take with some bold moves like this. I mean, look at Quebec and immigration, for instance. Bourassa's knife to the throat strategy resulted in Quebec having control over its economic migration policy, sending the numbers that it wants to Ottawa, its own criterias to Ottawa. And now François Legault is looking to extend that even further. But there's more and more provinces that are waking up to the fact that Ottawa has some very strong centralizing tendencies, that Ottawa likes to meddle to provincial affairs, and that they need to have this sort of policy. Maybe it's a little bit bold, maybe it's a little aggressive, but they need to have this sort of policy if they want to be able to counteract Ottawa's desire to meddle in their own provincial affairs.
Howard, let's ask the obvious follow-up question here, which is, do you know if any of this is legal?
I'm not sure it's even the right question. As Natalie said, these are sort of rhetorical gambits. What I described as sort of a policy of creative noncompliance, where a provincial government would decide the degree to which it wants to cooperate with enforcing federal laws it disagrees with. There is a tradition of that. It's rare, and if the provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan, use a similar power rarely, I would say it's broadly legal-ish.
Ish, okay. Natalie, how about this? If we're not sure if it's constitutional and or legal, do we at least have some sympathy or understanding of provinces wanting to have more power within the federation? That's really what this is at the end of the day.
Yes, and indeed, I think federalism is not a straitjacket, and it is there to evolve and to adjust. And I think the problem here is the way in which Western alienation, which started from the beginning, in Confederation, since you created a natural resource economy based on essentially one natural resource, oil and gas. As we move forward and we see that eventually they'll have to transition out of this in the medium term or long term, then it's normal to have disagreement of the pace of it, and it's normal to have disagreement about how the compensation, how you transition one province out of this dependency. It was Canada's choice to have that sole reliance almost on oil and gas, but it's not the only place in Canada that there's been some changes. Cod fishing had to be ended or transformed, and the federal government had to kind of readjust how it was going to support the Maritimes evolving out of it. When asbestos mining became, Quebec had to get out of this. Yep. In Ontario, it was tobacco farming, and so I think we know that the federalism has to evolve with the sentiment of the public just as much as it does in terms of trying to adjust to ensuring unity within its diversity, which is what federalism is.
Martin, I want you, if you wouldn't mind, to sort of lick your finger and put it up into the wind and give us your sense of how much support you think the Sovereignty Act actually has among the public in Alberta. We know the opposition's against it. We know that Premier Smith's predecessor didn't like it. How much of the public do you think's on side?
Yeah, so I think according to recent polling, it's probably around 30%, which is essentially support, right? So I think the vast majority, or at least the majority of Albertans are against it. But it really goes back to Howard's point that we don't actually know, and more than just being ambiguous, like we've seen essentially flip-flopping from the Premier on this. So exactly right. That initial document, the Free Alberta Strategy, talked about ignoring federal court decisions, and it talked about invalidating federal laws. Since then, Ms. Smith has climbed down, and so now we're waiting to see. And it sounds like we won't find out until after she's elected. She's currently running for her seat in Brooks in a rural riding, and sounds like we won't actually get to see the details of what she's proposing and whether or not it is in fact something significant, or if it's really just sort of more angry letter writing. But I think it's really important to point out that not a lot of people understand just how radical the proposal was, that it essentially did suggest that the legislature, not the courts, but the legislature would decide which laws are constitutional and which ones aren't. And I want to say also this idea of creative non-compliance or creative non-enforcement, I think there's an important distinction has to be made between not assisting the federal government in enforcing its priorities and trying to prohibit the enforcement of those policies and laws, right? And that's where the Sovereignty Act really gets into a bad space, and I think similar with the Saskatchewan proposal, because there have been suggestions at times that it would not just be about not assisting as we see, for instance, playing out with the gun buyback sort of policy right now, but rather also prohibiting, right? So that, for instance, that the Impact Assessment Act, Bill C-69, would not apply magically within Alberta, or that we wouldn't have to pay a carbon price within Alberta, right? So not just not assisting in enforcement, but actively trying to prohibit or somehow interfere with enforcement. And that, of course, is totally offside. And she can't do that. The Premier Smith can't do that and stay within the bounds of our current constitutional order.
Well, let's see what John Ibbitson from the Globe and Mail had to say about all of this. And to that end, I'll ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to put up a graphic of his recent writings about this. Here's John Ibbitson in the Globe. Progressives across the country have every reason to support the Trudeau government's record of new social and environmental programs. With more action coming on housing, what's not to like? Setting aside the fact these programs have contributed to record deficits and increased government debt, there is the cost to national unity. Aggressive federalism takes its toll. Aggressive federalism. Renaud, come on in on this and tell us whether you believe it is, in fact, the federal government's so-called aggressive federalism that is pushing the prairie provinces to these moves.
Oh, absolutely. And I would say it's not just the prairie provinces. I mean, we're feeling tensions when it comes to the equalization program in Newfoundland. We're seeing a sort of alliance against the carbon tax that we saw with New Brunswick, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Quebec, and Manitoba, and Ontario working on the same court case. So there's a lot of issues where Ottawa's tendency to centralize everything in Ottawa at the expense of the provinces has created this sort of anger and tensions in various areas of the country. I think now it's showing its head much more publicly out west with Western alienation, with these proposals. But it's by no means over in Quebec. The same sort of issues are still there in Quebec, and Quebec still wants to be respected as part of the federation. And it goes to show that when the federal government sort of tries to impose itself into areas of provincial jurisdictions. We've seen it with healthcare. We've seen it with childcare. We are now seeing it with dental care. We're seeing it with the Impact Assessment Act. It's progressively eroding the level of trust that the provinces have in the federal government as an equal partner.
I just heard Nathalie Desrosiers say under her breath, no.
What
do you mean?
That is this inherent in the federalism structure that you will have aggressive decision-making or aggressive legislation being pushed forward, taking the vacuum, So taking the lead on childcare may actually support and respect provinces actually making their own deal. So there always was a tension in Canadian federalism between the centralization being kind of forward-looking, social investment, environment protection being a good example of how important it is to have probably a national policy if you're serious about climate change. But, and then at the same time being what we called the laboratory of provincial policymaking that actually emulate each other or push a little further, and some provinces will be ahead of others and will be ahead of the federal government. It does create, I agree with Renaud, it's inherent that there's tensions. It's been like this since 1867.
Mm-hmm. Howard, how about you on that Ibbitson quote? Do you think aggressive federalism is what's prompted some of this?
I absolutely think it's prompted some of this, and a couple of examples have been mentioned already. One is C-69, the Impact Assessment Act. That is an example where the federal government was very high-handed in exercising its jurisdiction over environment, which we should remember is a shared constitutional jurisdiction, but it used its powers to claim jurisdiction over projects that are entirely within a single province. And Alberta pushed back on that, and they actually won. The Alberta Court of Appeal declared some aspects of that law unconstitutional. We'll see how that goes up to the Supreme Court. But that's a clear example of high-handed federal government policy, where even the Senate, with a Liberal-appointed majority at the time, recommended to the government that it amend that legislation to remove some of those more egregious intrusions onto provincial jurisdiction. And the federal government just ignored the Senate. And another is childcare. The recent childcare is one of those examples of what's called cooperative federalism, where I think a lot of provinces, including Alberta, were asking cooperation, but cooperation on the federal government's terms is all that's being offered. And So, I mean, a one-size-fits-all or even a margin of provincial, I don't know, negotiation being permitted, it's just wholly constitutionally inappropriate. I mean, this is a clear area of provincial jurisdiction. There's no way the federal government could legislate in this area, and yet they try and legislate indirectly by attaching conditions to these transfers, which are not federal money, particularly in a case of a province like Alberta. This is money that's taxed. The tax base is coming from Alberta. It goes to Ottawa, it goes back, and it comes back with conditions. And when those conditions are in an area of core provincial jurisdiction, that's absolutely inappropriate. And I think the province has a right to push back and say, this is none of your business.
Well, but in a way, the federal spending power, and that's what we're talking about, there is always a question. It's been for a long time about whether you could impose conditions or not on the money. The money is being taxed across Canada. It's not coming from Alberta. It comes from the taxpayers, and it goes to the federal government. And then it says, if you want my money, you're going to have to obey by conditions. And people fight back. And I agree with you. It has been an irritant for a long time. Yeah.
You say my money as though it's the federal government's money, and I would push back and say no, it's not. This is money that is collected by the federal government, but the fact that the government collects the money is not of constitutional significance, or shouldn't be, and shouldn't allow it then to interfere in areas of provincial jurisdiction. And I think this is an area where the provinces are actually trying to say, this may have been the way we've done it for 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 years, but
we're going to.
Yeah, let's quote, draw the line, as Saskatchewan would.
Well, let me pluck another incident out of the headlines from late and see if this is another example of maybe the Federation doing a little fraying at the edges. And that is the notwithstanding clause of the Constitution, right? Like, notwithstanding all of these rights which we have constitutionally enumerated, governments are allowed to set aside court decisions that they don't like for a 5-year period if they prefer to go another way. That's notwithstanding clause of the Constitution. We know that Quebec has frequently used this clause. Saskatchewan has now used it. Ontario, under Doug Ford, has now for the first time used it. He didn't like a decision about political fundraising, and so he set aside that court decision and put his own law back in place. I can recall talking to former Premier Bill Davis, who was there 40 years ago when the Constitution, minus Quebec, was signed by all the provinces. And the view was, the notwithstanding clause is something you use under only the most urgent emergency circumstances. It's not something you use willy-nilly. And we seem to be getting into a situation these days where it's being used more willy-nilly. And I guess I want to find out what we think about that. Martin, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, so a couple comments. I mean, I think this has actually contributed to a lot of misunderstanding, I think, in Canada and in the provinces. This idea that the notwithstanding clause applies to all and every part of the Constitution. And of course, that's not the case. It applies to specific charter rights, right? So the charter binds both the federal government and the provincial governments. And really what the provinces are doing when they're invoking the notwithstanding clause, they're not interfering with a federal law, but rather they're shielding their own law from judicial scrutiny, right? They're shielding their own law from compliance with the charter. So I think that's a really important first distinction to be made, because it doesn't apply, for instance, to federalism. It doesn't apply to Section 9. You cannot, notwithstanding, federal jurisdiction over GHGs or fisheries or something like that. So I think, that's the first point. And then the second point is, we are seeing that I think the theory was that as if, that the charter and the rights that it represented were so core to Canadian identity that the public would punish, right? The electorate would punish politicians who sought to override those rights for some other end. And I think what we're seeing is that that's maybe not necessarily the case. And with every use of the notwithstanding clause, our charter becomes that much closer to essentially losing its power. Right?
In fact, let me follow up with Renaud on this, because, if in the province of Quebec, the majority governments use the notwithstanding clause frequently on behalf of the Francophone majority in the province. So there's never a price to pay against the Anglophone or Allophone minorities when you're using the notwithstanding clause. Do you think that's problematic?
Well, first off, I would say you're using it to protect the French minority in the country. I think the notwithstanding clause is definitely something we should always be careful whether to use it or not. But there's a reason why this tool exists. And once again, I think it goes back to Ottawa's centralizing tendencies, which have sort of given the provinces this impression that if they want to be able to be masters in their own home, they need to use these slightly more extreme, more bold approaches and more bold tools to be able to have their own laws and be able to do their own thing in terms of areas of their own jurisdiction.
You know, Pierre Trudeau
Yes.
didn't want this clause in the Constitution 40 years ago when they were negotiating it, and he agreed to it because without it, there was not going to be any deal at all. Do you think, with the benefit of 40 years of hindsight, maybe he should have stuck it out and said, forget it, let's take nothing as opposed to this, because it is being used much more frequently to set aside constitutionally guaranteed rights?
Well, I think I would say it's too late to try to reinvent a year. You know, so we have it, and I think we're going to have to create some sort of understanding of when it is appropriate and when the courts will allow it to be used. Up to now, the courts have said if you use it, we're not going to oversee it. But the way I think the danger, and we as everyone, we should worry about this use because it has the potential of insulating completely a legislation that overrides that affects your rights. So it diminishes the value that we put on human rights. So that's not, we shouldn't do it. So I understand what Renaud is saying, that indeed, if governments feel compelled to do it because there's one court decision that really they disagree with, that's one thing. But that's not the way the new tendency is to insulate in advance. I'm going to use it in advance. I'm preempting it because I'm a strong government and I don't really need and don't want the courts to oversee it, even if sometimes it might be possible to win. You know, no rights is absolute in Canada, and therefore you can also use this Section 1. You can justify the violations. And courts have given lots of deference to government, both federal and provincial, in the way in which they try to justify some violations. So the point is, it's a dangerous tool, and we should resist it.
Howard, can I get your view on this notion of the notwithstanding clause is in the Constitution? Some people say, if it's there, I'm going to use it. Others say you should only use it in the most extreme of circumstances. What's your view?
I think you have to look at each use of it. So, for example, there was a case a few years ago where Doug Ford used it to push back against a court decision. This was when he was trying to shrink the size of the Toronto City Council.
He didn't actually use it. He just threatened to use it in that case.
Yeah, well, yeah, he did. Well, this goes to the point. So he was prepared to use it because the court decision was just so flagrantly novel in its interpretation of the Constitution that I think that would have been an absolutely justified use to push back against court decision. Now, he was saved from having to use it because the Ontario Court of Appeal stepped in and corrected the lower court. So that would be a case where I think there was a legitimate disagreement where the province was in the right. I think Quebec is a unique case, though, because, as you mentioned, Quebec didn't sign on to the Constitution in 1982. And one of the ongoing tensions between Quebec and the rest of Canada has been over a slightly different vision of government. So government, part of governing is the art of accommodating individual interests with sort of broader collective public goods and public goals. And the introduction of the Charter introduced into Canada for the first time a hyper-individualistic American-style approach to rights. And that's just not compatible with Quebec's vision of Quebec society, particularly when it comes to language, the preservation of language, and certain aspects of a Quebecois culture. And I think this tension has always been there, and I think it's absolutely appropriate for the government of Quebec to use the notwithstanding clause to vindicate this alternate view of government and of society and the purpose of a society, and that we need to respect that, using what Charles Taylor calls respect for deep diversity, not just differences in the country, but different visions of how a society can be organized. Now,
that could be done under Section 1.
Well, and I think it should. I think this is, I think one of the reasons why the notwithstanding clause is still very relevant is that quite early on, the courts made a decision to have Section 1 be, if not a total afterthought, more of an afterthought. And I think they took a much more aggressive approach to assuming oversight over day-to-day aspects of public policy. And having done that, having sort of changed the terms in which I think a lot of politicians signed up and agree to the charter. I think it's not just reasonable, but actually incumbent upon governments to reclaim some political power over what are quintessentially political decisions by using the notwithstanding clause carefully, thoughtfully, but only as rarely as the courts require them to.
Well, let's just in our last few minutes here ask the overarching question. And Natalie, I'll go to you first. Do you think all of the things that we've been discussing here tonight are putting undue stress and pressure on our federation?
I think we are at a difficult moment. I think we will survive, and I think it demands creativity and understanding, a sense of compromise, and it depends also the ability to disagree without blowing the tent, blowing up the tent, if I may use this expression. So I think that the way in which our system has evolved has been to sort of compromise and move a little bit the federations to avoid extremes, and I think it will continue to do so.
Renaud, your view on whether we're putting undue stress on the federation with all of these moves?
I think it's necessary stress. The fact that Quebec still hasn't signed a constitution, and there are still all of those tensions that exist within countries, show that there's a sort of uncomfortable balance, and there's been a sort of uncomfortable conflict between Ottawa and the provinces for the last 40 or so years at least. One thing I am very careful about, or one thing I see as a rising threat is just the fact that there's this growing separatist sentiment in the West. And now, of course, it's not a majority of people, but we've seen it in Quebec. We've seen how this plays out. We were at 49 and 51 back in 95. So there's a real need for the federal government to start having this dialogue with the Western provinces to sort of at least address some of the criticism and some of the concerns. To go back to the earlier point made in the introduction, the West wanted in back in the 90s. I think increasingly some people in the West want out unless we address those issues of alienation.
Last 20 seconds, Martin, to you on whether we're putting undue stress on the federation with all of this.
Yeah, so I'll totally disagree and say that it's really not Western separatism or alienation, but exceptionalism. And the proof of the pudding is in the arguments that are being put forward. The Sovereignty Act is blatantly unconstitutional, and you don't reach for blatantly or bonkers ideas when you think actually what you're doing fits within the rules. So really what it is, it's exceptionalism out West anyways, trying to renegotiate the terms, trying to renegotiate the Constitution. And I think that Canada, I agree with Natalie that Canada and the federal government should carry on and deal with these things as they will. And if provinces feel like they have to engage in these kind of desperate measures and desperate actions, well, then their electorate will deal with them, I think, accordingly.
I think we set a record for the use of the word bonkers on TVO tonight. We used it a lot over the last half hour. Thanks to Martin Olshinsky, to Renaud Brossard, to Howard Anglin, and Nathalie Desrosiers here in our studio for joining us here on the agenda tonight. Merci beaucoup, tout le monde.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Merci.
Thanks.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.